United Nations Development Program, UNDP Resident Service Center in Africa. And he has 10 years of work experience at the managerial and among others has entailed as a senior management and monitoring and evaluation advisory for the World Bank Pacific Risk Insurance Company, high-level dialogue facilitation with the UN Office of the Special Advisor for Africa, for whom he conceptualized, convened, and participated in expert group meetings on topics which sharpens the continent's response to emerging global challenges, and multiple country program management and coordination, for whom he had led continental projects and developed training manuals for the AU and the regional economic communities on issues relating to treaty making and domestication. He is also the founder of Peace Builders Without Borders. So he'll be doing discussing some of these big things once our panelists have made their input, and it's going to be very exciting going forward around some of these big themes that we will manage from this conversation. And for the audience, I would like to encourage you to use our chat box to drop in your insights or comments or questions that you'd want to ask the panel to respond in relation to the conversation that we're going to have today. So we're going to have a very interactive session, and I'm sure you're going to find it useful and worthwhile for your time. So without further ado, I'm going to just give a little bit background about African Policy Circle, whom we are co-convening this platform with. It's a network of African-based think tanks that work together to develop solutions to African problems. The network takes a transnational approach to governance issues, but also strives to empower its members to inform and influence policy at the country level. The network values collaborative learning processes and the production of robust evidence-based research to support common positions and policy recommendations on critical African development issues such as human rights, good governance, development, natural resource governance, localizing SDG, among others. And so we are very honored as Democracy Development Program to partner with APC to convene this important conversation. Now, we know that this conversation is taking place on the eve of the BRICS Summit, which is scheduled to take place next week from Wednesday. And so we know there's been significant geopolitical headwinds that are really influencing this conversation as we speak. And we know that there's a flurry of information flowing from all kinds of places in terms of people's perception and trying to understand where BRICS is at the moment and what is its ongoing reconfiguration with the expression of interest from different countries seeking its membership, as well as also the bigger question, what does it mean for our continent? So to help us to really get to understand this, I would like to introduce my colleague and a panelist, the first panelist, Ms. Anusha Naidu, to give a intro comments around the BRICS and its future and how she sees it playing out going forward for our continent. Over to you, Sanusha.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much for the invitation and to be able to share some of my thoughts. Please forgive me for not having my camera on and also for me sounding so nasal. I think it's just par for the course in this time of year where it becomes rather difficult with the change of season. I'll try and be as brief as possible so that we could have more interaction. And to answer your question, Paul, I think the BRICS, in many ways, up until the 14th summit, which was last year hosted by China, the BRICS, the tension that the BRICS were getting in global context, was very much, is the BRICS a sustainable platform? Do these countries represent a challenge to the status quo of the international system, and so forth? And I think what has happened now is that following the whole issue with regard to the relationship between China and the US and the kind of engagements that have been moving, as you mentioned, in the geopolitical headwinds of the BRICS, and the way the BRICS finds itself in the context of the geopolitical architecture, has raised fundamental issues around whether the BRICS represents a challenge to the status quo of the international order. And to a large extent, the challenge is really around whether the BRICS represents an alternative to this international order or to the alternative to the G7. And these kinds of normative narratives that have come out are mainly defined in terms of how they are assembled in media that tries to say that the BRICS doesn't necessarily represent a change to the system, that the countries that make up the BRICS are very eclectic. They don't have a single vision or identity, that they are made up of so-called democratic states and authoritarian states or single-party dominant states, that they don't represent the kind of liberal value norms that define the international system going forward. But I think what we need to do is take a step back here. And your question is, what is the future? I think the future is not just the future of the BRICS. The question is really, what is the future of the international order? Because this international order that we're looking at, and the kind of dynamics that underpin the architecture of this international order, has raised questions about whether this international order that we talk about is sustainable as well. So there's been this debate out there in terms of whether or not the architecture after 1945, after the end of the Second World War, how much does that architecture create a level of engagement, inclusivity, and most importantly, I think the challenges around the change. And the one thing that you got to remember about the international system is that the only constant in the world is change. And right now, that change is being reflected in terms of the challenges that are being represented around whether the rules-based system that emerged out of 1945 has now moved towards a power-based system. And that seems to be some of these frameworks or these issues that underpin the kind of debates that are happening about the BRICS. So in a sense, I think when you talk about the BRICS, there's a lot that's being defined as whether the BRICS are going to be successful as a grouping going forward, and are they going to coalesce in terms of developing a coherent identity on the one hand, and whether or not they represent a challenge to the status quo on the other, which is still the preserve of the gatekeepers of the world after 1945. Interspersed in all of that is the questions around what is really happening in the international system. And I think what we've seen is this kind of incredible shift from the rules-based system to a power-based system. But the power-based system is really where a lot of the challenges and the inherent contradictions are emerging in terms of whether the system remains the same or whether it has to evolve and whether it's fit for purpose. And the BRICS is coming into that architecture. And what it's representing is that the world is not static, that the status quo is never one that remains constant, it's constantly evolving, and that the information of the BRICS, whether you could talk about it as a Jim O'Neill construct, or whether you talk about the fact that Russia, India, China, or Brazil, India, China, had essentially, even before Jim O'Neill's, at the time when Jim O'Neill was conceptualizing the BRICS, and the BRICS was really not necessarily one that we see today as he spoke about it as the BRIC, but really the question was, how do you reduce transactional cost, the financial transactional cost around questions of using a currency that you cannot necessarily deviate from, in other words, the dollar-based system. The other issue is being able to reduce transactional cost in terms of utilizing payments in local currency. So really the BRIC was talking about these issues in terms of how do we reduce our macroeconomic vulnerabilities, and how do we actually then utilize financial instruments and architecture that enables us to not be caught in the headwinds of the dollar or the headwinds of a global reserve currency that we have no control over. And most importantly, it determines a whole lot of other dynamics in terms of the financial architecture, in terms of commodity pricing and other pricing in terms of liquidity raising in the international markets and so forth. And so today, the question is, does the BRICS then represent an alternative, or is it now opening up the global architecture to choice? And I think that's more or less where we are. The idea that countries want to join the BRICS, I think was said very nicely by Ambassador Sukla, the Sherpa for South Africa on the BRICS. And Ambassador Sukla, I think about 10, 15 days ago, made a statement that said that something very tectonic is going to be announced at the forthcoming BRICS summit. And whether that's about, expansion of the BRICS or whether it's, those are key issues. I think what it does represent is that the Global South has now come to a point where it's saying, we want to start thinking about our own agency and our own voice. In other words, we're not going to be still sitting and knocking at the door of the Bretton Woods institutions or those institutions that we don't have the ability or the utility to shape, but rather we are basically being not being enabled to basically get the kind of value addition that we want. And I think this notion of the BRICS expansion comes into the space of whether that is what BRICS is trying to do, or is it that the Global South is rising and the Global South has finally found that it has its ability to now start asserting its agency in the international arena. And the question of locating and contextualizing the BRICS in that process is really around whether the expansion is to represent the agency of the Global South and the rise of the Global South, or is it about also how countries in the BRICS want to utilize the expansion for their own vested interest? And I think that's the kind of tethering that's happening in the BRICS in terms of the tensions, and whether or not broad consensus has been reached in terms of the mandate that was given to the BRICS countries to think about from the 14th summit last year. And so two things have to be very clear. Expansion is going to take place. The question is, have they decided on criteria? Have they decided on what the principles and frameworks and the modality of the framework of expansion would look like? Last week, Minister Naledi Pandor did a briefing on BRICS and on the summit and spoke about expansion as part of that briefing. And one of the things that she said in that briefing there was about 23 countries that are going to be joined or have put up their hands to join. And it's quite an interesting crew of countries. You've got countries that, for example, South Africa may not want to endorse joining the BRICS, for example, Morocco, because of the Western Sahara issue. But then you've got the state of Palestine, which you can see South Africa would be one of those countries will be endorsing because of how it positions itself on the question of the Palestinian state. Then you've got Iran there, and you've got Saudi Arabia, and that I think is the part of the rapprochement between what China negotiated as a thawing of relations between Riyadh and Tehran. Then of course you've got Argentina there, which again is linked to China's role, China's ability to move in terms of pushing for a greater traction with the Latin American region. Then you got Bangladesh, which again forms part of what India sees as BIMSTEC. So if you're looking at the expansion of the countries that want to join the BRICS, there's very real geopolitical issues as well and geostrategic interests that inform what the 5 countries are looking at in terms of which countries are going to join and how this is playing out. And there are inherent tensions, because one of the issues is that India is very, very aware that China must not become too dominant in the BRICS because of the experience that India has with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that China dominates. The last point to make, I think, in terms of where is this all going, I think the challenge for the BRICS countries is, first and foremost, before you expand, you've got to find out what your institutional identity is. You can't expand without institutionalizing your identity. And I think that's going to be key, because at the moment, the BRICS has institutions like the bank, and I want to actually talk about the bank, but I'll come back to that in the bigger discussion, because the bank is moving beyond just now about just giving loans, or concessional finance. It's also now looking at how it's going to be utilizing some kind of framework around being mandated, I suspect, by the 5 core countries to define what a BRICS expansion strategy should look like. And so that's also very key to the institutional architecture. So I think the future is that we will see an expanded BRICS. It's part of the fact that the international architecture has for too long been kind of caught in the architecture of the world of post-1945. But having said that, I think we're also entering a point in which the post-Cold War period is also receiving its own kind of challenge in terms of whether it's fit for purpose. So after 1990, the euphoria of the unipolar world and the liberal democratic economic order is now also going through its own existential crisis. So I think the BRICS is kind of opening up the space to say that it's offering choice for countries in the global south who can hedge their bets and not only be in the Bretton Woods institutions. And that raises questions around development finance or equity, and of course the question of whether you can move away, not necessarily creating a third currency, global currency, but also use currencies like the renminbi and so forth to transact in terms of local payments and so forth. So I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you so much, Sanusha. That's very insightful background to what we are talking today. You touched very powerful points that we'll come back to them as far as the inclusion criterion what would probably be the criteria they might use, seeing that the reality is that we're going to expect to see the BRICS expansion and in terms of its membership. The issue also of development financing, which is really critical to African development agenda. Then again, that's also a powerful talking point, because I believe the continent is hungry to grow its economic, especially as a post-COVID recovery strategy. But then it's the how and what needs to be taken into consideration, managing the tensions of using the BRICS Bank, Development Bank, as a facilitator of financial access versus the Bretton Woods institutions also that have a significant hold of the continental development agenda. And of course, the themes around, using local currencies other than the dollar as far as the BRICS member states are concerned. So I think that's very powerful conversation. And I'd like to bring in Professor Isaac Tambula at the stage to speak about from his point of view in relation to the African development agenda and the BRICS Bank. Where do you see that going, Professor Isaac?
No, thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for that. And I must also thank Sanusha for opening up and basically touching on the focal points that are related to BRICS, and particularly in terms of their role within the international system, of which, again, some of the points that Sanusha has already alluded to, I will also focus on. So based on the talk that I was given, which was focusing mainly on the future of development in Africa, with a particular focus on the role of the NDB, of which is one of the most important institutions that emerged in the last 5 years or so, particularly in relation to what developing nations are trying to do within the entire international system. But I'll also be looking again in terms of the challenges that exist, and as well as the prospects that are there for Africa and other developing nations. But most importantly, as I do this, I think the most important thing to start on is by reflecting on some of the core developmental challenges that are facing many African states. So here we are referring to key challenges such as low GDP and as well as low GDP per capita in terms of growth over the last 10 to 15 years or so. And we've seen that it has mainly been a few states in Africa that have been doing quite well in terms of economic growth and as well as development, particularly looking at countries such as Kenya, looking at countries such as Ethiopia, which was doing quite well, and as well as Rwanda. But that particular growth has not been affected throughout all African states. I mean, if we look at the South African context, we see the regress that the country has been making over the past 10 to 15 years in terms of institutional effectiveness, and as well as meeting particular developmental aspirations that were set in the National Development Plan. And again, we also look at a key issue of the high rates of informality. Again, from a particular sub-Saharan perspective, you understand that more than 80 to 90% of the economies are based on the informal economy. And again, we must also understand the nature of that informal economy as an economy that is precarious and has a lot of people that are working in poverty. And then again, this talks about the need to transition our economies into formal economies so that people can have better opportunities economically. And again, we also face a lot of issues that are related to political instability. We've seen what has recently happened in Niger. Look at Burkina Faso. We know what is happening in Congo. And all of these key issues, again, also impact on Africa's development prospects. And we also, again, focus on key issues of which become a huge part of what I'll be talking about, related to the issue of poor connective infrastructure. I mean, if we look at key things such as roads infrastructure, we understand that huge parts of Africa's development depend on these roads being tarred, but majority of the roads in Africa are not tarred as yet. We look at the port capacity. I mean, South Africa was doing well over the last 2 or 3 decades or so, but now it is battling under pressure in terms of port capacity, and that on its own also impacts on the country's trade and growth as well. And we also look at the key issue, which is fundamental in terms of access to electricity. We understand that up to 65% of Africa's population does not have access to electricity, and that on its own is a huge issue that also impacts on Africa's development. And again, in the South African context, we're also facing these key electricity or shortages or energy insecurity. And we also again look at key issues that are related to the dependence on natural resources, of which has not necessarily had many African countries because of the Dutch disease, because African countries tend to rely on particular industries that are based on natural resources. I mean, one of the key arguments that has been made by the African Union and as well as the African Development Bank is that most African nations do not want to move away from agriculture because they see it as a source of mass employment instead of transitioning to an industrial mode of development. So the ability to balance the two, again, has been one of the fundamental challenges that we're facing. And lastly, again, in terms of some of the key issues that we are facing, if you look at the increasing disasters that the country is facing because of climate change and the water scarcity that many African countries are facing, also talk about some of the key issues that are related to some of the SDGs that we are failing to meet. But because in terms of this presentation, we also need to understand the nexus of these particular issues within the BRICS framework. So in terms of the BRICS, we understand again that, I mean, in terms of the global share, there is more than 40% now of the population that resides within BRICS countries. And that on its own is a huge population that gives you access to markets. And one of the key questions again is, why have these African countries been failing to develop their own produce that will also respond to the local market needs? Because we understand majority of some of the imports are mainly coming from Europe and other countries. So that on its own has been one of the fundamental issues that we've been facing. But if you look at the growth prospect that the BRICS has been facing over the last 10 years or so, again, based on the BRICS statement that have been released, we see that the BRICS is really trying to galvanize all the developing nations, because there's this idea that the BRICS is slowly emerging as forging an international coexistence that is driven by the common development agenda for developing nations. And as to whether that is true or not, there have been several debates. I mean, I recall an edited book that was edited by Professor Nzenze and Professor Munyai, whereby they were looking at to whether the BRICS is an antithesis of the West or it is mainly complementing the West, of which are some of the key issues that Zanusha also touched on, and particularly in terms of the world system that is based on a rule system or whether it is based on a power system. So these are some of the fundamental challenges where the BRICS is also finding itself in. But if we move on to the core issues now that are related to the BRICS development, to the BRICS New Development Bank and African development, we must also understand that in terms of what has been happening, we see that there has been an increase in trade between Africa and BRICS countries. So particularly if you look at some of the statistics, they show us that the BRICS imports to Africa increased by 12% between 2006 to 2017. And then again, the BRICS share of exports also increased by 14.5%, of which moved from 20.1% to 34.6% within this particular period. But if you also look at the exports again, we also realize that the BRICS African countries also more than tripled in terms of exports, moving from $45 billion in 2006 to 140 billion in 2017. And those statistics are staggering. They show that there's a particular shift that we are witnessing in the international system based on trade. And then again, during the same period, we also see that imports from African countries nearly doubled to BRICS countries, moving away from $48 billion to $86 billion, right? So within the particular period. So majority of these trade arrangements are mainly based on the aggressive nature that we see through India, China, and Brazil, and their increasing influence in Africa, particularly in countries such as your Angola, countries such as your Mozambique, where again we see that the Chinese government has really invested quite in a particular area. But one of the key things that again that we also need to touch on is the issue of the New Development Bank. And as we understand, this has been something that the BRICS countries have been working on since 2012 in Delhi. And the ability of these particular BRICS countries has been based on this idea that there's a need to mobilize resources to accelerate infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS countries. But over the last couple of years, we've been seeing that they are trying to move away from not just focusing on BRICS countries, but to also say, how do we then open up to developing nations, particularly because of the relationship that we see between your Bretton Woods institutions, such as your IMF and your World Bank, and how as to how the policies that they implement have been used to subvert certain policies from African countries in favor of Western countries. So this is one of the particular areas where the BRICS is also trying to address by saying your IMF and your World Bank have not necessarily been promoting interests of these developing nations. They've been mainly promoting policies of the West that are mainly one-sided and will mainly benefit in the West. And in this particular role, again, we must also understand that in terms of the key needs of Africa, we are looking at key infrastructure issues that are related to transport, because we understand having effective and efficient mechanism of transport also lowers the cost of businesses, and it also attracts a lot of investment. And then we also look at social infrastructure based on schooling and hospitals. And we also look again, because we are based on the digital age, whereby information, communication, and technology infrastructure is very important. And this is where the BRICS also sees itself playing an important role. I mean, one of the particular examples is that South Africa was received $1 billion US from the BRICS for South Africa's national non-toll road management and program, and as well as the $550 million US that was also received by Russia for its locomotive fleets. But again, what we also need to contextualize then when we move to the African context then is to ask, so how has the BRICS National Development Bank, or the New Development Bank as we know it today, had responded to African needs? And if we look at the NDP strategy between for 2017 to 2021, we realize that it has been mainly silent on the engagement with African development. And again, we can also see this during the COVID-19 era, because that is where, again, there was an opportunity for these developing nations to move away from the dependence on the IMF and the World Bank to say, how do we then work with the BRICS countries in order to finance our own developmental needs? But again, the BRICS was nowhere to be seen. Yes, it did assist South Africa, but not other big nations, and that is on its own is a missed opportunity for the BRICS to play an important role. But there are also opportunities now as we look towards what is currently happening, because some of the opportunities that we are also looking at now are people that live away far from our sources of fiber or internet connection, because we see that over 300 million people in the continent live over 50 kilometers away from sources of internet. So that on its own suggests that there are particular niche areas whereby the BRICS countries, and as well as through the New Development Bank, can also make critical interventions. The fact that 65% of African population remains without electricity on its own again suggests that there are various ways into which the BRICS could utilize its finances, particularly through the green energy deals that they are trying to embark on to address some of these fundamental shortfalls that we see in the country. And then again, some of the questions that we also really need to ask ourselves is, what is then the role of the BRICS or its significance within the context of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement? Because again, should we be opening up to these BRICS countries as well to say, in order to boost our trade, we must expand all of these? Or should, again, as an important question, should we also be expanding this to all developing nations so that we can increase trade amongst each other and move away from the dependence on the West or not? And how do, again, based on the number of countries that have requested to join the BRICS, how do we then as developing nations use the new development bank as our avenue to say we will mobilize resources and invest in this particular bank so that it can cater for the needs of developing nations as a way of changing how the global architecture of international development is managed. And again, one of the key things again is how do we then also promote balanced trade? Because we know India and China are quite aggressive in terms of their trade with African countries. But how do we then ensure that the trade is going to benefit both parties and not just benefit one party and reproduce the kinds of relations that have existed with Western countries? And again, one of the key fundamental issues that I'll also mention in terms of domestic finance in Africa, we understand Africa does not have a large base of domestic development finance. And that is mainly because of the lower taxes that we get every year. And as an important way, again, one of the key things that also need to be focused on is on this idea of leveraging from knowledge sharing, particularly within the area of state-owned institutions, because we realize China has internationalized majority of their state-owned entities. How do we then replicate this particular effort to developing nations so that they can have certain key learnings that they learn in order again to be replicated within the new development bank, whereby we say SOEs can gather together within this particular bank and share common development areas, and as well as share knowledge as to how to improve how they manage resources and how to make broader impact so that they can also internationalize at the end of the day. And thank you. So for now, I will leave it there.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Isaac. It's very powerful insights around how development agenda is being conceptualized within the framework of BRICS and the challenges that it has to confront. But I think the biggest worry is that it has been mainly silent, and perhaps maybe there is some behind the scenes conversations taking place. But I think you've touched on that powerful point around how do they manage the tensions between financing development agenda on the continent as a BRICS versus already the Bretton Woods institutions also want to make sure that they also have a presence and be seen to be actively working in financing development agenda in their continent versus also what we see African Development Bank itself doing. So very interesting perspective there. I would like to bring in Dr. Charles here on this point and to tell us about how he sees BRICS, for example, as an alliance navigating through these difficult contours versus also managing the issues of security and uprisings that we see on the continent, countries getting into conflict. And you know, there's also very powerful geopolitics playing in that space that somehow have been also been allegedly accused to be fueling the conflicts that we are seeing. And what do BRICS do in this situation? Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, colleagues. I see that we have about 24 people on the panel. Thank you so much for joining. Yes, interesting preface there from Sanusha, my former colleague on IGD, and Prof. Kambule from Wits University. Yeah, Paul, the question which you posed specifically to relating to the security situation on the African continent is one which is very interesting. And like Sanusha had mentioned, when it is posed, it seems like people are putting the alternative. Like, has Africa now chosen military rule? Has Africa now chosen to move away from democratization? And my response is an emphatic no. Africa remains committed to the principles of democratization. However, if we have regular and free elections which do not translate to the bread and butter issues which the people of the continent want, this becomes a challenge that when you have strong men ruling countries and who utilize structural means to give themselves unlimited terms in government, then you leave the people sometimes with no option than to celebrate the alternative, which sometimes come through unconventional means. And I mean, for instance, if we have to look at the Sahel. The Sahel has had countries such as Cameroon, Chad, take off term limits. And Chad is now the one that, having taken off term limits, is being put to go to Niger to say a coup is bad. Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, Alassane Ouattara took off term limits. Almost nobody contested, and he's given himself a third term, which is unconstitutional, by the way. No one has contested. Now he's the one standing to say, we need military intervention because we don't want coups. So when Africans are now confronted with a situation where you have institutionalized coups led by civilians, what option do we have, especially if the concept of civilian as well is not nuanced, to realize that even the military, that they are an umbrella of the subset of what we call citizens, because citizens is a subset of civilians. The military, they are part of that, of another envelope, which is citizens. So to the extent that governance deficiencies are beginning to edge their big heads out, and that the people that we have ruling in many cases have actually decided to be more loyal to the West than to be accountable to their people, they are leaving the people with no other means than to support unorthodox means to actually take over power. So it's not an alternative. It's not whether or not Africa is choosing military coups or Africa is aligning with democratization. Is that we need to have a household conversation about what democratization means in the African continent and what governance really means if it is not self-serving for the people. Now, where does BRICS fall in all of this? Sanusha mentioned that whilst we look at this as an alternative, we need to be very careful because the international system that was set post-World War has now left cracks, which have led to people questioning whether this system is even sustainable. It has widened the gap between the North and the South and doesn't have any remedy for changing that anytime soon. And the South is where the resources are coming from, but the North is where the development is actually happening. So there's a point to which the people in the South have to say enough about our resources. And I think this is also where some of these coups are playing, because the military leaders, juntas that have actually emerged, they have said they are actually here to protect the resources of the people. They have ruptured military alliances, which have existed post-colonialism, in the bid to indicate to the people that our resources have been going at a very cheap value from the global market and that they are there to right those wrongs. So resources start playing right at the center of the conversation of the secularization of Africa. And so from that perspective, some people want to sweep that under the carpet to say, no, let us focus on whether or not militaries should be ruling. No, we cannot focus on whether militaries should be ruling without looking at how the current international system, which was set up, is actually ripping off Africa of its resources, and without blinking, that even what they call aid, that aid is so insignificant compared to even what Africans themselves send back home in the name of remittances. So this international system is shaky, as it were, right now. And whether or not BRICS is an option is not very clear, because as Professor Kambule said, there are many developmental challenges which the African continent still faces, which BRICS doesn't have a solution to. So as long as those challenges continue, Africans are going to be edgy about whether or not they are going to solve these issues themselves or whether or not these issues are going to be solved from somewhere. The positioning right now is the West is aligning themselves to say, Africans, you are either going to endorse LGBT or you are not going to get aid. You're either going to support the Western agenda or you are not going to get aid. The approach of either or, which inadvertently is an approach of threat, is one which is actually getting Africans to build themselves more resilient. After all, just recently, 2 years ago, African countries were refused medical kits in form of the vaccines for COVID. This has also awakened in Africans the realization that for Africa's survival, Africa needs to think inwardly. And Paul, if I may just conclude to say that the challenges which Africa faces, yes, I agree with those that Professor Kambule mentioned, are not that we lack resources. Yes, we have 65% of the world's arable land. How do we utilize this to the benefit of Africans? Is it BRICS that is going to come and help us farm? Far from it. So there are internal conversations happening right now at the African level about how we can leverage on this. And quite frankly, I can speak on good authority to say that as of before COVID, the country Ethiopia was receiving was importing wheat from Russia worth to the tune of about $800 million per year. In the last 2 years, because of the disruptions in the supply chain, Ethiopia has embarked on a wheat self-sustainability program. And this year, Ethiopia has imported zero wheat. So the country has saved 800 million from wheat. And this wheat miracle has prompted Ethiopia to say, hey, wait a minute, what else have we been importing? We have been importing cooking oil. And Ethiopia has said, no, let us invest in soybean and cooking oil. And they have realized the same kind of results. And so Ethiopia is foregrounding itself as a miracle story for Africa can actually be self-sustaining. And they've now embarked on another one, the rice production, just so that they can move away from importing. And I think this is the direction that African countries should be taking or are taking, because the conversations are broadening. That yes, BRICS is presenting itself to some as an alternative, but BRICS is only presenting itself. First, it is self-serving to the members, which, as Professor Kambule mentioned, just to some extent, because the challenges which South Africa experiences, for instance, with energy, the BRICS don't have a solution to it. Neither does the South African government has a solution to it. Where is the solution for those challenges going to come from? That the conversations therefore have to broaden, and looking at the era, for instance, of the African Continental Free Trade Agreements to say, what can Africa leverage from one another? Zanzibar, for instance, is the highest spice producing country in the world, but the spices produced from Zanzibar are taken where? They are taken to India across the ocean, across the Atlantic, and then processed, and they come back to Africa called Indian spices. Well, Africa really needs to have a conversation with itself about how it can transpose its agricultural produces to fine consumables that can, first of all, address the food self-sufficiency needs of Africa before even supplying foods to the world. Kambule also mentioned the issue of digitalization, that some governments are now reaping the benefits of digitalization, and that has helped in a great deal to reduce corruption. In my country, for instance, when you pass through a toll gate, you have to pay cash and receive a receipt. Sometimes you pay cash and you don't receive a receipt. Sometimes somebody gives you an old receipt and receives the cash. That system of governance that we have, which has not digitalized, that it is not self-serving to the African continent, and that countries which have attempted to digitalize, that they are actually reaping benefits. And this is an internal solution resolved around, or which has emanated largely by African governments that have actually said, enough with corruption. We are not going to wait for BRICS to come and tell us that enough with corruption. We have to find means in which reducing or ending corruption is going to be self-serving to the needs of the African people, or it's going to give governments the resources to meet those commitments that they have made to the African people, and cease from the dependent on the West, especially when they are putting conditions such as you have to endorse LGBT before you actually get aid. Now, if we can project a message to say, if this is what you want and we're not going to do it, don't say later on that you are supportive of gender rights, because your resources, which came before, did not come before because we're supporting LGBT. If you want LGBT, you should put aside an envelope for it and not say that everything else should actually suffer, because the system of threat which is being put in place is one which is not self-serving to the current international political system, or it is one which is not even advancing the Western agenda, which they actually think, except for a smaller quotient of people who practice LGBT. And no offense to them. In some countries, they've seen growth, largely because of the endorsement, or stability, largely because of the endorsement of LGBT rights. But to the extent where people are stuck to the fact that their cultures have to be protected, I think that the BRICS are actually demonstrating to the world that we protected our cultures, we used democratization only what we could. Russia today largely speaks Russian. China largely speaks Mandarin. India largely speaks Hindu. That those that are leading BRICS countries, that they have protected their cultures, and their cultures have helped them to become global powers to contend with. That Africa should not, therefore, compromise its own values just because they want to they want to align with a global, with an international system, which, by the way, is shaky. I'll end there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles, for those very insightful comments there in response to the two presentations. And I think you touched a very powerful point there, especially about the position that the West is putting Africa on, to choose either to be supported because they're supporting a dominant, idea that is coming from the West, like you mentioned in the LGBTQI issue. And so trying to tie their aid to the continent based on these big themes that they feel they're important to them, but are not serving actually the interest of the continent. That's a very powerful thing. And I think we need to have those kind of conversations as we look into more how is Africa going to position herself and increase her agency in making sure that whatever these big development formations are coming up, that really the interests of African people remain at the center of the development agenda. I think that's very important. Of course, touching on the issue of protecting our culture and identity as African people. If Chinese people still trade and converse with the rest of the world through Mandarin, the Indian community from India speaking Hindu, and Russian speaking Russian, why are we not having some level of identity, cultural identity as African people, so that we can also ensure that we do not lose ourselves as a continent while mingling with all this development agenda that is taking place on our continent, as far as also access to resources to finance some of the big developmental projects that we have on the continent. Very powerful sentiments there by Dr. Charles. At this stage, I would like to bring in Ms. Yanga to talk to us about, having had all these different conversations around the maneuvering that, if I use those words, that our continent is trying to, reposition ourselves through our African leaders in making sure that we still remain committed to a development agenda, not to get sidetracked by the geopolitics, and secondly, by ensuring that we are treated fairly as an equal partner, which is always a big challenge because there's always a big brother syndrome as far as these things are concerned. How does Africa really get herself to a place where it can also be at the forefront of shaping the developmental policies in the context of BRICS, which I understand, of course, BRICS has its own think tank, but who represents this think tank, and to what extent does that think tank produce knowledge products and policy positions that really do reflect the aspirations of the African people? So over to you, Yanga.
Thank you very much, Dr. K. I think you gave me a little bit of a tougher topic here that's a bit sidetracked from what our speakers have said, but I'll try my best nonetheless. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here, and good afternoon to my panelists as well. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think, Dr. K, before I get into the role of think tanks in general, it's very interesting to me that you had shaped this conversation into speaking about the relationship that Africa as a whole, as a continent, would have with this particular regional bloc. And it placed me in a position of wanting to reflect of within Africa itself, how are our RECs functioning, our regional economic communities. And obviously, we do know that most of the time our regional economic communities are functioning with the overarching gaze of the African Union principles and charters guiding them. And as Charles had already mentioned now in his remarks, that the fight for democracy is a fight that is very eminent and prominent in Africa as a whole. But it's very interesting to me that the way that the economic relegation of it does not necessarily center democracy, but has the prioritization of development over the political system in and of itself. And I think it would be very much amiss of me to be someone who's in the human rights world to not point out that the two are actually very much interlinked. The only reason why there has been this resource abuse, at least from the current African leaders who have, as Charles has pointed out, being under Western capture, that's the nice phrase I like using, is because of the fact that they have disregarded the political system that is there to protect individual rights, the political system that is there to protect individual freedoms, and the political system that works hand in hand to ensure that everybody has access to the resources to begin with, right? So it's very tricky to see that, because when you look at then the makeup of the African Union in its entirety, you've got member states who have committed themselves to charters such as the Constitutive Act of the African Union, charters such as the Election and Governance and Democracy Charter, charters such as the Youth Charter as well, which highlight the fact that there needs to be an ongoing commitment to the democratic agenda in order to have that full human development fulfillment, that full economic development. And something such as the African Free Trade Continental Agreement was birthed out of those particular principles, right? So it's very interesting to me that in the conversation of the expansion of BRICS now, which is where we are now with this 2023 summit, the insertion that Africa has kind of put itself when it comes to BRICS is an insertion that they have been articulating for a really long time in the African Union, dating all the way back when it was the OAU to begin with. And I think the speakers have alluded to it, that it's Africa just wanting solutions to the dire problems that they have, right? But I also think that this 2023 BRIC Summit is a very unique one in the sense that when BRIC was formed and then a bit later on BRICS in 2011, the geopolitical landscape was not what we see right now, right? I think we all know that the world is facing a very turbulent and rapidly shifting global political environment. And the invasion of Ukraine by Russia overturned, the post-Cold War European security order, as Sanusha had kind of highlighted for us. And the West very much so consolidated itself within NATO, and this US-China rivalry has significantly sharpened. And a lot of critics have even said that perhaps BRICS at this particular point in time, perhaps this was not the conversation when the organization was being formulated, but at this particular point in time has become a position in which China can flex its muscles, right? And China flexes its muscles, I think, in one of the most interesting ways, where it's not the hard diplomacy that some of the speakers have kind of alluded to, the give me this or else you won't get A, B, C, and D. It's been softer diplomatic bilateral relations that China has had in Africa. And it doesn't come as a surprise that Russia and China are in the BRICS countries are the ones that have even proposed the possibility of an expansion to begin with. And I think it would be very also important to point out that the expansion of BRIC might not necessarily mean with the increasing of member states themselves in the organization, but rather speaking of the possibilities of having a structure, for example, such as a dialogue partner type of relationship, because of the bilateral and interdependency relationships that have already been established with the countries outside of the BRICS platform to begin with. So it's a very interesting conversation behind expansion, but there's obviously the harder pushes on expansion where you now have your UAEs and Saudi Arabia really wanting to insert themselves into it because of the geopolitical order being so out of place, right? So with that being said, and I think the speakers contextualized this whole thing well, and I just wanted to add my 2 cents on that side. This particular year's BRICS is also unique because in the China summit of BRICS, this idea of expansion was proposed, but without any frameworks on what this expansion is going to look like, on what the consensus is going to look like for it. So South Africa has this enormous task next week in figuring out how it's actually going to be looking like. And part of that conversation is then discussing the expansion then, I guess, of what research is going to look like when it comes to BRICS to begin with. And I think this is where the role of think tanks comes in much importantly. So if you just go to like a theoretical perspective on what think tanks are to begin with. So think tanks are, your brokers of policy, knowledge, they are the centers of research, and oftentimes incubators for new ideas. They are somewhat of a channel of knowledge amongst scholars and policymakers, and most importantly, civil society. We'll get to that point a little bit later on. But one of the things that makes think tanks so wonderful is that they often create a conversion of multidisciplinary theory and empirics into insights and recommendations packaged to inform and meet decision makers' needs. They inform policy, they inform, even the statistics that Prof. Kampule had come up with, where the GDP is standing, and those types of research that comes from, the knowledge of think tankers. And it is often done with the aid of saying, now, these are the numbers, this is the data, how do we move forward in terms of policy? And then they also play a role in expanding policy perspectives and possibilities. And within the context, which is where we are at now with the BRICS conversation, within the context of democracy and emerging markets, they are central to reform and informing reform decisions, right? But it does not come to me as a surprise that a lot of the think tanks that are centered around BRICS work produce knowledge that is geared towards economic research outcomes, right? And these economic research institutes, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, but we have to look at the nature of this relationship here in BRICS. It definitely was not established on we are on the same page with political motives. It was established on we are on the same page with the economic drive that we have, right? So these economic institutions catalyze change by raising an awareness of economic issues and initiating discussion and showing policymakers a way forward. The expertise and leadership should have the potential to strengthen and mobilize civil society. And economic research institutes have kind of established themselves as the big research think tankers, actually, in terms of policy framework for market economies, which is exactly at the core of what BRICS is actually about. It's about the market, it's about the economics. And they explain the benefits of these different market systems, and they publicize barriers to open markets, chart a direction for market-oriented reforms, et cetera, et cetera. But the role that they are supposed to be playing is that in governments where dominant economic policy making is a closed process, and of these governments, you can think of, your China and your Russia, think tanks come in as this opportunity to enable a less centralized decision-making by widening that access to data and information. And I find this very important because if we look at the think tanks that are functioning with the primary focus on BRICS, we think of the BRICS Academic Forum, the BAF, which was established in 2009. And this was an academic forum that was established in India, and it still has its headquarters in India. And it was, this platform for these deliberations and discussions for academic institutions across the BRICS countries, which was something that was a breakthrough, right? By saying that by virtue of me being a colleague at the University of Pretoria, I can connect with my colleague at JU in India, and we can collaborate on some academic work that is related to BRICS. That was the vision behind it. And it's very interesting to me that some of the key works that came out of BAF was research on information security, consumer protection, most importantly, technology and science, entrepreneurship, and water security. All of these could not have been produced without the prioritization of economic development. And then within South Africa itself, we had established the South African BRICS think tank, or SAPT as it's well known. And SAPT is a very interesting approach that they took in terms of research, because they often are working in collaboration with the National Research Fund to work with other think tanks within South Africa. If there's one thing South Africa is blessed with, we're endowed with think tanks. So SAPT kind of said, okay, how can I use this existing system of think tanks in South South Africa to still produce knowledge for BRICS. So they often fund other think tanks in order to write about particular topics that they are interested in. And then in terms of Brazil, Brazil had established the BRICS Policy Center, and it has its headquarters in Rio de Janeiro. And the BRICS Policy Center also is the more unique one for me. This is the one that has the flexibility of bringing in Chinese and Russian researchers through annual symposiums that they have every single year to come and exchange information. But Russia and China do not have established think tanks within their own countries under the guise of it's already being done in South Africa, it's already being done in India, it's already being done in Brazil. There's no need for us to go there. The backside of that is, of course, that research think tanks often function under the guise of civil society, and they can be a step up for civil society mobilization. So by virtue of them existing within those countries, there's a risk that the government might not have enough control of the type of information that is disseminated coming out of there. Not to say that the governments themselves don't have government-funded and based research tanks within their own countries. But for research tanks that specifically focus on the outside workings, they need to be regulated within. So I think it's very important that we don't exclude the implications of the political system and how these countries function to begin with, and the type of setup that they would have for think tanks and the support that they would have to begin with. Obviously, some of the cries that the BRICS think tanks have had is that it's really great that these conversations happen amongst member states when they meet at their summits, but funding towards them can become quite limited, and the processes and the bureaucracy behind it can be quite difficult. Now, Dr. K, the question you had asked is, now, where does Africa fit into all of this? I think think tanks are an opportunity for Africa to fit into this conversation regarding BRICS. I think there's numerous, research that is being done in different areas that perhaps is being done in silos that is in relation to BRICS. And this is one of the avenues that African states can make use of to enter through. Now, if this expansion situation does work out, and more African countries are part of the conversation, and they're part of the vision of BRICS, that obviously means that that's going to have its ripple effects on how think tanks themselves also going to function moving forward. That means that the think tank content is also going to expand itself. But this comes as well as a caution, especially with what we've seen with the Indian Ocean Rim Association. When you have so many member states in one particular organization and so many dialogue partners in one particular organization, the subsect groups that are supposed to make the vision of those member states come true end up suffering a bit because the agenda is constantly fluctuating and changing because of said geopolitical turbulence, said positions that member states might be having at a particular point in time. And on top of that, it can also mean that there can be an overproduction of data. And where there's an overproduction of data, it becomes very difficult to find a place where it can be, disseminated in a way that is much more packaged and tighter and streamlined, which was unfortunately the trap that the African Union had fallen into. There was so much data and information coming in that now the academic sites that are trying to support the African Union are quite literally overwhelmed by the complexities that have been happening behind it. So I think there's an intrigue in keeping BRICS, not making an argument for BRICS expansion or not BRICS expansion, just making a balanced one here. There's an intrigue of keeping BRICS streamlined because of such things, at least from an academic perspective, but I think in terms of a think tank perspective, it's one of the entry points, most definitely, in which African researchers can come to the forefront. And, like I said, part of the key things that think tanks play is you are the innovators of policy making. You are the innovators of new ideas. Think tankers are the ones that help the decision makers to decide on where to go. But not also ignoring the fact that oftentimes the type of publications think tanks would be producing are very much dependent on who the financer is. So if we think about the fact that a lot of the think tanks in Africa, as we speak right now, are highly funded by Western funders, oftentimes it has been relegated that the information is susceptible to being biased towards whatever the donor wants to see coming out at the end of it, right? And so if African researchers can plug themselves into the BRICS side of things, if the expansion were to happen, perhaps that place to breathe, that Charles is calling for, would be possible to publish resources as is. But that's not to say that that isn't already a challenge in Africa to begin with. We think about, your think tanks in Uganda. The statistics over there have often been called out to not be valid statistics, because all statistics have to go through the government itself. And an authoritarian government is the one that has to approve what is being published, and it has to make them look good. So it's some of these difficulties that come with the space that think tanks are functioning in. And I think I'm also just going to leave it there. But I just wanted to say that, financing makes a plays a big role in terms of the type of content that is being produced. Financing can also be the entry point, especially if this BRICS expansion thing does happen, for African researchers to lead on how they would think BRICS would work out for Africa, or not think BRICS would work out for the rest of Africa. And, the research side of things can also be a platform of figuring out, in terms of our current status of political systems, what is it that we can play as an academic to shaping things a little bit better without having our lives at risk at that stage as well. So yeah, Dr. Kell, just leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Yang. So much insightful themes around how can play a role. And it's very interesting to note, of course, the challenges of funding, access to funding, the challenges of navigating the difficult political systems, as we see, as Dr. Chas had mentioned a little bit earlier, that we're seeing African governments becoming a little bit more decisive on what can be accessed by the public in terms of information and knowledge dissemination, which is very tricky because it depends on which side of the think tank is aligned with in terms of its agenda in contribution to the national development plans on the agenda of the country, because that might mean that the political leadership either sees that or perceives that think tank as an ally or actually as an enemy of whatever they're trying to do. So those are not easy spaces to navigate, but I think it's an important conversation, as we see, as we heard from Zanusha earlier on, that the reality is that there's going to be an expansion, but what form it takes is a question. And then how does that expansion influence the role of think tanks, including the BRICS think tanks itself? Right. Thank you so much, Yanga. We're going to get back to you later on. For now, I noticed two questions that have been put on there, and actually comments. One is from Patrick from our chat box, and he's saying Africa must remove the strongman. And I'm assuming there has been a lot of those kind of examples on our continent. So the one person who kind of controls the direction of the nation. It's not good for democracy and development in the African continent, as much as Patrick is for BRICS, but its leadership present the ideas of strong person or strong men as positive and good for the nation, giving an example of China and Russia. So I think it's a well-noted point here. We've been talking about it, how this is one of the political conundrums that think tanks have to really think about. They have to move the conversations to be more centered to the development agenda that is unattached to political imperatives, which is always very difficult to do so. But the idea of also making sure that it's not driven by one person, that is also very important, because it's almost an anti-democratic process, and if it goes that direction. Marcel Abraham says that brilliant insights from Ms. Mambotana. I think she meant Younger. Right. I want to bring in Sanusha. You have a question. Would you go ahead, Sanusha?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the colleagues. I think it's been a fascinating and very insightful characterization of the BRICS. I just want to touch a little bit and expand on what my colleague Younger said about the BRICS think tank, or the think tank context. The BRICS think tank is a fascinating, complex structure. Yes, the BRICS Academic Forum was initiated in 2009 when the group came together in the Russian city. But then in 2013, South Africa proposed, when South Africa joined in 2010, and then officially joined in 2011, when South Africa hosted the first BRICS summit in Durban in 2013, they proposed the BRICS Think Tank Council. What South Africa also did was propose the BRICS Business Council. And these are key institutions that need to be understood in terms of what the relationship is between the Think Tank Council as a broad network and, of course, the Academic Forum. Under the Think Tank Council, which is where the South African BRICS Think Tank Council is located within the national, within the National Institute for Humanities, under that framework, it actually goes out and has funding from DHET. And the funding that comes through wherever the streams are from DHET, the Department of Higher Education, then they actually go out and they do a call for proposals on different areas and different themes. But what is critical is that in the other 4 countries, you have key drivers. So in South Africa, the key driver of the BRICS think tank in the South African context is the SABTT. In India, it's the Observer Research Foundation. Younger pointed that out. In Brazil, it's the Institute for Applied Economics, IPEA. In China, it is the China Council on the BRICS think tank. And in Russia, it is the Russian National Committee for BRICS, which is linked to the Duma. And I think this in itself tells you what kind of thinking the think tank council has. Because when you have the academic forum brings people together from different think tanks across the domestic environment. So, for example, the last think tank meeting that was held, academic forum that was held in May here in South Africa under the SABTT, you got invited from different institutions. So either the Institute for Global Dialogue got invited, the South African Institute for International Affairs got invited, and then a few others from universities that were individuals, etc. In the case of India, they invited their group of national institutes or national academic institutions. So I think understanding that dynamic of how it works in an operational way is very important, because it gives you a sense of what the direction is in terms of the focus. And very importantly, yes, it is about the economic governance, but increasingly now it is about the strengthening of the multilateral. And of course, each country that hosts the BRICS for that year or chairs the BRICS for that year will actually have a theme that will link up to its region or link up, in addition to the region, to the question of the strengthening of the multilateral and inclusive development or sustainable development. If you look at the theme of the conferences, even the summits and even the academic forums and even the many meetings that have been hosted now in the run-up to next week, a lot of it is linked to South Africa's kind of outreach. The other thing South Africa did in 2013, which other BRICS kind of took on in innovation, and what China has done is taken South Africa's outreach program and Partnership for Africa and innovated it and called it BRICS Plus. And that's where we're sitting with regard to expansion, is BRICS Plus is now evolving into the question of whether it's BRICS expansion, BRICS plus E. if that's how you want to call it. And that in itself tells us that South Africa was innovative in the way that it saw things. It just didn't really run through with some of these things to the point where it needed to get to in terms of taking the BRICS outreach expansion with Africa and defining, not necessarily defining a strategy for Africa, but enabling the AU and other regional bodies and institutional bodies to be able to define what their nexus would be in the relationship with the BRICS. And I think we have to look at this as well in context of the G20, because India as the current chair of the G20 has been very, very vocal about the African Union getting a seat at the G20 as a bloc like the EU does. And that is why I think India's hosting of the G20 coinciding with its hosting and chairing of the BRICS, and possibly going forward in other dimensions next year, is that it's trying to elevate itself as the voice of the global South. I think the idea that the economic is fundamental, because it is fundamental, but it's becoming geopolitical as well, very much so. So I think we need to clarify that the BRICS Academic Forum falls under this kind of network of the BRICS think tank councils, but there's five think tank council members that come from the 5 countries that basically are the conveners and have convening power. The other point I wanted to make about BRICS, and I think we have to be very careful here as well, is assuming that BRICS is going to be a panacea for anybody in the global South, not just Africa. The BRICS countries, or the BRICS themselves as an institution or as a grouping, have decided that they are going to create institutions. So the New Development Bank, starts off as this important incubator of kind of finding a way for financing. But countries like the UAE, and in particular Saudi Arabia, are also looking to be, I think the UAE has become a member of the New Development Bank. But the point that we have to be very clear on is that the economic architecture has become geopoliticized. And that geopoliticization of where we are currently with trade, with economic governance, with access to markets, and so forth, all of that suggests that raising equity in the financial markets today is costly. And so what's really important as well is, if you are going to start using the dollar as the only currency of transaction, then you are raising your own macroeconomic vulnerability. And you're caught in the headwinds of secondary sanctions, and you're caught in the headwinds of not being able to do business because you are bound by the SWIFT financial payment system. Now, what is happening is that this conversation around the economic or the financial reform of the global architecture is not to replace the dollar in a way. It is actually to find ways to reduce transactional financial costs, because you want to be able to use BRICS Pay, which is a key issue. But the bigger challenge for the BRICS countries is, who wants to hold the rupee? Who wants to hold the ruble in terms of transactions? So that's, and China has been very clear, and so has other countries, have been very clear that holding reserve currencies in X currency markets, etc., is something that they have to get around. What they want to do, and I think is very clear, is they want to create e-commercial platforms. So if you go to China today, you don't really carry any cash with you. Everything is on an e-commercial platform. Everything is done through artificial intelligence and recognition and so forth. So the point is that the more you can find ways with cryptocurrency, with blockchain technology, and e-commerce platforms, you're reducing some of your transactional costs in terms of hard currency. The final point I want to make is the perceptions of BRICS. I don't think the BRICS have ever said that they're going to create a system that's going to be an alternative. They're just opening up the system. They're opening up a system where, as you move into the international system, international architecture currently, the international architecture currently is unpredictable. You don't know where it's going. You don't know what's going to happen with the challenges of the Ukraine crisis, but more importantly, the question around access to commodity markets. And this is where I think it's becoming even more difficult to predict, because the international architecture at this point in time is not necessarily one that you can find traction in. So if you want to raise money in the international system today, and if you're looking for ways to do that, I think the bank has started to lend in currencies of the BRICS countries, the 5R currencies, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, the rial, and the rand. And it's fascinating, all of those currencies start with R. But, in a sense, what is interesting as well is that the BRICS are also very apprehensive to become a model like the Bretton Woods, or to represent that, because it makes it difficult then for countries like China, who are very cautious about issues like this. So if you're really listening to what the Chinese think tanks are saying, and you're really getting what the Indian think tanks are saying, there's this incredible, interesting dynamic where both are cautious, but in different ways about both are cautious on the financial side, but one is more cautious than the other around the expansion, because I think expansion will definitely raise questions around where does the core nucleus of the BRICS go. And the last point is really the question around, will it be an expansion of new members joining, or would it be a kind of staggered approach? And the Russians are proposing something of an observer and friends of the BRICS and then partners of the BRICS, because at the end of the day, you also don't want to end up in a situation where the BRICS themselves, as the 5 nucleus countries, have actually diluted their own leverage in their own grouping. And then, of course, the question is, where does this all go? Because you have to ask yourself is, if the BRICS are going to move forward and if they want to preserve themselves as the 5 core, then the challenge would be, there's the other side of this, and that is, do they have a mutually assured defense pact? So the military alliance in the BRICS is going to be critical as well, because you have that on the other side with NATO. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much, Sanusha. That's a very powerful insights, especially on the possible criterion that might be used to talk about the expansion, which is highly expected in the next week's summit, that the leaders will be able to talk about inclusion and how it will look like. The approach is the issue. I think it's what will be very insightful to see what approach will they use as far as including new members is concerned, and then what the configuration will it look like as BRICS. Will it still be called BRICS, or it will be called BRICS Plus, or whatever the name that they might call it, be dependent on the issue that they are going to be considered as important for consideration as far as membership is concerned. And you've touched a very powerful point around military alliance, and that is very, I think that is almost like a given, because Russia's presence, for example, on the continent, as far as military intervention is concerned, is really well known. And of course, China as a peacekeeping missions country, constantly sending peacekeepers in different hotspots on the continent. But we must also not forget that the US also has its own military bases, and so is France, and of course the Britain. So how would this play out eventually? Do you foresee, and I'm going to ask this question to Dr. Charles, who is an international expert on these matters. How would this play out if we have, for example, military alliance from the BRICS versus the existing military connections and networks on the continent from Russia and Britain and China as a peacekeeping nation that keeps on sending peace missions here, versus what would be the connecting points that will make this kind of military alliance work in favor of the continent?
Thank you very much, Paul. I would just start by making an anecdote, and that is to say that a river runs muddy before it becomes clear. The BRICS might be struggling right now to define their identity and to define their sphere There are a number of challenges competing for the BRICS attention, including the last one, which Sanricha mentioned, which you have just mentioned. I think in the global configuration of power as it is today, whilst we have NATO, which is a consolidated bloc, we have isolated nuclear powers, which are emerging and which are proving quite stubborn to Western threats. These are, for instance, Iran, North Korea, and it's left to see how or what sort of alliances can come to bear from these. You would agree with me that the military alliance which NATO led in 2011 against Libya was a disaster, admitted by the United States President or former President Barack Obama, that this is one of the greatest mistakes of his foreign policy. So to the extent that NATO and the leading force in NATO, or the leading state in NATO, the United States, is engaging in quite a number of strategic mistakes, including, amongst others, in Afghanistan, there is a caveat in the securitization of the international system. Whether BRICS will congregate to feel that, I think that caveat, even right now that over about 40 countries globally are supporting Ukraine in the fight against Russia, is already indicative that NATO is fully behind the war against Russia. And Russia standing on its own to this point and heading to 2 years is an indication that if Russia were to lead a military alliance, that the BRICS would become a paper tiger or a child that has actually failed to grow. So to that extent, and looking at the security configurations of the African continent, one would say that the challenges which Africa is facing, and which in many cases they are being seen as security related, that these challenges are currently, or the peacekeeping in Africa is currently largely led by Africans. And this has been so in the last 10 to 15 years, with the Africans leading in the peace mission in Mali, the Africans leading now in the peace mission in Central Africa. And these actually grow out of baby steps, which Africa engaged in contributing enormously to the peacekeeping missions in the DRC, to the peacekeeping missions in Darfur. That Africa has come of age to actually lead in its own securitization agenda. And whether or not this leadership in securitization agenda means that Africa has the arms to protect its sovereignty is another thing altogether. But suffice to say that what the BRICS are putting up against NATO is something that one has to really watch carefully and see whether NATO will survive. The US president, about a fortnight ago, or almost a month ago, indicated that the US was running out of arms. And the White House quickly ran to correct that, because it was a terrible admission that they were losing out in supplies to Russia, that a lot of what they had as up-to-date ammunition, that by the time it was getting to Ukraine, before it could even be lifted off the air, that Russia had the intelligence to annihilate a lot of that. That is the current security configuration of the globe. That is also in itself shifting without even North Korea or Iran coming to bear. So if these were to come together and be part of the plus in the BRICS, then NATO would have a lot to rewrite in its history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles, for that insightful comment around securitization on the continent. Should BRICS Plus continue in the direction it's going, I think there'll be very interesting opportunities there for discussion with those who manage these processes, and ensure that in the process that Africa does not lose her identity, as you correctly characterized, that she's actually now leading peace building efforts on the continent and having a say. But there's always the question of funding of these military operations. And I wonder if I were to bring in Professor Isaac Kambule on this one, is it something that the BRICS Bank would want to focus on from your perspective? Professor Isaac?
Yes. Yes, can you repeat the question? You're asking if it's something that the BRICS Bank would like to focus on in relation to?
In relation to this military funding, being that it's also
military
part of the broader agenda of development of the continent.
No, thank you so much for that question, Paul. But I think at the moment, I wouldn't necessarily say that it is something that is in the foresight of the BRICS, particularly through its new development bank, because again, if you look at its architecture, there are certain things that it is currently prioritizing, such as ensuring that there exist sufficient funds to address some of the developmental backlogs that developing nations are currently facing, particularly in such as critical infrastructure. And by critical infrastructure, we are both in the social and landscape, particularly infrastructure in the form of ensuring that the necessary schools, it is necessary roads that will lead to investments, and that the connective infrastructure that is needed is primarily going to be in place. Because I think one of the fundamental issues with military support is that in the African context, and as such as we see again in Ukraine, that such support does not necessarily end up in the correct hands most of the time. Because again, I remember that there was an article that focused on Ukraine, and some of the key things that they were highlighting was that majority of the financing that is going to Ukraine does not necessarily reach the government because of the high levels of corruption that the country was facing. And secondly, again, another key issue was that even in terms of the arms, majority of the arms end up in the black market. So that on its own suggests that no proper mechanisms and structures have been fully developed by these particular countries. So in this case, it becomes very important then for the new development bank to focus on the SDGs, because that is where majority of their focus is. I mean, again, if we reflect on the SDGs, realize that they mainly reflect the common developmental challenges that face majority of the developing nations, whether we are looking at issues of poverty and inequality, whether we're looking at issues of hunger, we are looking at issues of access to services. So those are fundamental things that are mainly within developing nations. And again, if we look at the funding that has been approved up to date, we realize that majority of it again has been towards sustainable development, particularly in terms of infrastructure, and as well as the funding that was given to India in terms of its national housing project that it was undertaking. So that on its own, I think, sums up that the key funding mechanisms that is found within the new development bank has been mainly focusing on uplifting BRICS countries. And as I mentioned earlier on, that for now, I think the most important thing is whether the BRICS has the sufficient capacity or foresight to expand the NDB as it has already done. I think countries such as UAE were very much eager in terms of joining and contributing to that. But how do we then ensure that the financing within the new development bank is going to reach all developing nations? Because I foresee it as being the one critical area whereby they can make the most impact. And as we see again, there are certain countries that are no longer taking funding from the IMF or the World Bank, because again, they want to be independent. So based on the idea that the BRICS are trying to create an alternative global order whereby there is no one hegemon, then again, it suggests that there is also an opportunity for the new development bank to develop funding that is tailor-made to the needs of developing countries, and particularly, again, I mean, key issues that are related to what Dr. Charles mentioned earlier on, that, you know, with policy conditions that often come from the IMF and the World Bank, you often see that, again, they come with policy conditions that will want certain states to remove certain protectionist policies in their industries in order to receive this funding. And again, this is something that we are also experiencing in the South African context related to the energy issue. the fact that when the government was also borrowing money, some of the key indication and highlights that were made by the World Bank was that South Africa needs to continue with its structural reform and then again needs to do away with certain SOEs. And ESCOM happens to be one of the key SOEs where there's a particular contestation between the Just Transition Project and as well as to what the South African government may want. And on its own, Paul, I mean, it also gives us a particular understanding. I mean, we are often reflect with friends and say, China is one country that has the necessary capacity to address some of the foremost challenges that they are facing. But in the South African context, it is failing to also galvanize all the skills and capacities that exist within the country, address some of the fundamental flaws that we are facing. Again, takes us back again to countries such as South Africa that have not necessarily put themselves in a place where they are able to hold their own sovereignty in the international system. For example, as I think there's an article that was a couple of weeks back, and they was focusing on the idea that within the BRICS countries, South Africa is the only country that to this particular day seems to be dictated in terms of what needs to happen, particularly with particular dictations coming from the West. I mean, if you look at a country like Brazil, President Lula is able to come out and say we need to move away from the dollar, but there is something that cannot necessarily happen within the South African landscape because much of its economy is based on the Western economy. So South Africa to this particular day is failing to create itself as a particular sovereign state that can withstand the influence of the US and the West. And this is why, again, I also highlight that in as much as these countries are within this particular grouping, there are certain contestations that exist with particular countries such as South Africa that have not necessarily removed certain trenches from the Western ideas. And this again also goes on to key issues that are also faced within BRICS countries. I mean, if you look at the issue of China and India on its own, there are certain border clashes that they continue to have to this particular day. So you can imagine if the BRICS, again, through the new development bank, were also financing all of these, or were also financing the military operation. So that on its own suggests that that particular military operation could also be used against each other in one way or another whenever there are certain conflicts. So I think for now, in closing, I would say the primary focus again should be focusing mainly on the core infrastructure needs of Africa, because I identify that as the one main primary area that is also inhibiting Africa from unlocking investment from within and from outside the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Isaac, for that. I think it's very clear and the clarification that the primary agenda of the development bank is really to finance development processes of the continent, and I think that makes it very, very much focused in terms of even with the inclusion of new members possibility as from next week, that it will not be distracted from that path, which I think would be, if there's anything to be at least celebratory about, would be that it remains focused in inspiring development agenda of the continent. At the same time, also, I would like to also use the remaining few minutes we have as we start to wrap up, kind of speculate where the conversation next week will go, although we've started some of those things, especially around the inclusion, the membership reconfiguration of the BRICS as in current state, and of course the issues of identity. But I would like to put this back to Sanusha, as we speculate that one part of that conversation next week will be around how do this new reconfiguration influence South Africa's foreign policy, for example, or even of the member states, given that they're already divided on who should be considered to come on board, and based on whatever insights they have in terms of what these new countries bring on board. Because I'm sure it's not just the numbers, it's about the possibilities of access to markets, leveraging resources from different countries, and at the same time also creating a bigger pool of members that do not have to necessarily have to run to the Bretton Woods institutions for any development agenda, for example. What would be the implications Sanusha, for South Africa's foreign policy, for example, but also for other member states on the continent?
Okay, so let me just go back a little bit to the bank. And I think the bank is a very important institution in terms of the creation and what emerged out of the BRICS after 2009. The bank has an African regional office, which is based in Johannesburg. And that office is really around how does the lending or the financing for infrastructure development also address infrastructure needs in the region. The challenge with what's currently happening around the AFRO and the fact that South Africa's relationship to the bank, to the office is interesting, is that the funds have come to support South Africa's interest in terms of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. And people like Danny Bradlow, who have been writing about evaluating the impact of and the success and measuring the benchmarking of the NDB outside of where it is now, have raised questions around whether this dominance of South Africa's relationship and the funding, does it really open up the space for other African countries regionally and beyond to access financing for the bank, from the bank? And I think that's a key consideration. So if you're talking about where does the bank move in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of opening up and expanding its portfolio and access to financing to other countries in the region with regional offices, and they've done one also now in Brazil. So there's these regional offices of the bank, extensions of the bank in regional settings that essentially is supposed to push forward around the financing and the developing financing of infrastructure projects and renewable energy projects and so forth. And I think that's going to be a key consideration. So if you tie the expansion in the context of South Africa and possible members of an expanded BRICS that come from the African continent and what the implications will be for South Africa's foreign policy, I think the problem or the challenge for South Africa is they had innovated or they've created the African Outreach Partnership, but it just stuck. It never went forward. And the Chinese innovated on it. And I think the window of opportunity is closing very fast for South Africa to be able to develop a strategy with 3 to 4 countries in the continent that can say, this is how we envisage the role of the BRICS and the relationship between BRICS and the African continent. Remember, the BRICS countries, each of them, with I think the exception of South Africa, all have an Africa summit. So do you really need the BRICS to determine your Africa strategy? No. So I think we've got to basically start being less naive about this and more pragmatic, that Brazil has an Africa summit. It's called the Africa Business Summit. Russia just hosted its Africa Summit. China has FOCAC. India has yet to host its 3rd India-Africa Forum Summit. South Africa doesn't have a summit. It talks about Africa as the pivot of its foreign policy, but it talks about it in very broad platitudes. It talks about its role in institutions. It talks about its role in the G20. It talks about its role in the African Union, etc., in the UN and so forth. But do you really need to have an Africa strategy for the BRICS? Because each of these countries have bilateral relations through their Africa summits. So I think that's going to be a key challenge for South Africa's foreign policy going forward, is how do you then understand that your pivot in your foreign policy, which is Africa, and if you look at the national interest framework document, it's all built around it's built around the national interest, both domestically, but also because of a better Africa. And that's been the byline in most of South Africa's foreign policy documentation, that it's about Africa and Southern Africa. So I think at the end of the day, the challenge is that South Africa has to think about the expansion and should have thought about the expansion when it started in 2013 as a member with the first summit, and said, what does the Africa outreach mean? And how do we pivot that further with 3 to 4 countries that are going to be key to us in terms of consolidating and pushing forward the voice and agency? The second point I want to make on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is we the SABTT last week hosted a workshop on this. And I had the privilege of moderating it. And what's very key is that all of the other BRICS countries, India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, Brazil, and the other partners are saying that they will not necessarily try and shift away from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. What they are arguing is that what the African governments set as their terms of reference under the ACFTA, they will abide by that. So if they set the terms of reference around tariff and non-tariff lines, it is that they would abide by. So I think we've got to be careful in assuming that the BRICS are going to have a strategy for us in Africa. It's more about what is our engagement with the BRICS going forward, because the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, if I understood it correctly, has a section or a instrument in the ACFTA which says that countries can determine their external third-party engagements, which means that you then go against the grain of what the ACFTA is. The ACFTA then means that if country X wants to have a bilateral with India, it can. So I think these are issues, these normative institutional issues, and the issues that are basically needs to be coordinated in what an ACFTA means for Africa needs to be decided by Africans. China, India, Russia, Brazil will just come in based on what is presented to you. And I think South Africa finds itself in a dilemma, because at the same time, we're talking about an expansion of the BRICS. There's also the question of the AU as a member of the G20, and South Africa will join and host the G20 in 2025, and that's going to be critical as well. So I think these are flashpoints in South Africa's foreign policy. But for the other countries, an expansion of the BRICS is actually geopolitical. It's leverage, it's influence. China can dominate. India wants to contain that domination. They don't want an emboldened China. It's all about how these different countries will play out in the geopolitical architecture. I'm not sure whether South Africa has ventilated that enough in its articulation of expansion. I think it's there, but it hasn't said to countries, I will oppose Morocco being a member of the expanded BRICS because of Western Sahara. They haven't said that. It's there. So I think there's a lot of this kind of nuancing that needs to be understood from the geopolitical dimensions of this. And then the final point on where the BRICS may be going, or rather what will be the iteration of the BRICS, is really the coordination of the BRICS themselves. In the next 5, 10, 15 years, I mean, if the next time we're hosting the summit in South Africa, it will be 2028. By that time, we don't know what our domestic political architecture will be like. We don't know what the domestic political architecture will be like in the other BRICS countries. So I think, again, the domestic environment and the political environment in each of the BRICS countries will play a significant role in also where the BRICS finds themselves. And I'm not sure whether I agree with Isaac, the bank won't fund this kind of militaristic kind of approach and security or whatever, because of how this will play out. But I think domestically, the BRICS we'll also have to consider where they'll be politically in the next 5, 10 years.
Wow, thank you so much, Sanusha. It's really powerful insights on what we should expect, and perhaps maybe something that we should watch very closely as the summit unfolds next week. I want to bring in Charles here from his experience with the African Union and related bodies there. What do you think will be the role of African Union, if there is any, Charles, in this new reconfiguration of BRICS and its relationship with Africa?
Thank you very much, Paul, for that question. I don't think that the African Union, as it were, currently as a bloc, has a position as far as the BRICS is concerned, not even the African Union as a secretariat. I think the union is busy with a number of things, including the AFTA, which has been mentioned, but also in the next 2 years, we are going to have a new chairperson. So the current chairperson is eclipsing his mandate and he's soon going to be lame duck. So first to see what those who emerge from this, or those who emerge or who would intimate interest in succeeding him are going to put forth as the agenda. But I rarely see that the agenda is going to be about BRICS or NATO. I think the agenda is going to largely be about how can we leverage on the opportunities of these sheikhs in the global configuration of states to benefit Africa using Africa's own resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I think that's also very important because there has been always a question around the role of African Union in all this as a mother body that really should be driving some of these continental conversations more broadly. But with the transitions in its experiencing at the moment of leadership, perhaps that's something that they would want to watch first of all to see where this goes before they really put their hands onto it. Also very interesting to watch how that will turn out. Professor Isaac Kambula, in your last few words about the where to now of the bank, now knowing that its agenda is very clearly marked and succinct. Would you foresee, for example, the issue of trading with the local currencies becoming an active policy action emanating from the summit?
Thank you, Paul. I mean, you've raised an important question of which seems to be what is currently dominating the global south in terms of trading in domestic currencies. And we know that the president, probably President Putin, and as well as the likes of President Lula, have been very vocal on a particular issue. But I think, look, it's something that has been happening in certain quarters. But for African markets, I think it becomes one fundamental question as to what happens to the issues of macroeconomic stability. And this is where, again, the role of the African Development Bank needs to come in terms of really advising majority of these African nations as to what could be a potential way of going about in terms of making this work, particularly in terms of issues such as that have been discussed previously. Firstly, there's an issue of a BRICS currency that has been proposed for a long time. And I know that a lot of academics, particularly at the HSRC, have been engaging on the idea. But again, as to what are the prospects of a common currency in the African setting, right? And that is one of the key questions that have not been resolved to this particular day. So I think those are some of the key things that we also need to engage with if we are to really understand as to what are some of the key issues that will emerge. But guaranteed from this BRICS summit, a key issue is really going to be how are these countries going to trade amongst each other using their domestic currencies, particularly within the BRICS nations, and as to how they also seek to influence these amongst the different nations that are trying to join the BRICS grouping. And I think in closing, again, as a departure, I would say one of the key things that, again, that we also need to look at is the relationship that we can build between the African Development Bank and the new Development Bank, because within the African Development Bank, you also have all the kinds of expertise that are needed in terms of managing big projects, and as well as identifying niche areas where Africa needs support. So I think that relationship on its own could be quite influential in terms of making the right investment in the kind of critical infrastructure that is needed to spur growth and development in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Isaac. I think as we wrap up now, there's consensus that we're expecting the expansion. That's a reality. But we also agreeing that there will be criteria that will be put in place, which we're looking forward to hear what that will look like. But also the understanding that there will be collaborative efforts to ensure that the loopholes that have been remaining unanswered at the moment as far as coordination is concerned, as far as reconfiguring the development agenda and the role of member states within the BRICS Plus configuration will be, that will be insightful to look at and watch out. And of course, not forgetting that there is still more work to be done behind the scenes to ensure that no one loses. It's actually a win-win game for everyone involved, of which will require a lot of balancing acts on different aspirations and interests of the member states, including the BRICS Council itself at the moment, the configuration of the five. That would be an interesting space to follow. And I will, perhaps if it's not for our time, we could have liked to have a follow-up conversation after the BRICS summit. Maybe we would, but I don't know at the moment. To see whether some of these conversations and the threads that we'll be able to discuss about here will find expression in some of the post-BRICS summit policy positions coming next week, that will find somehow weaved in some of the broader discussions that the leadership will be able to discuss. So I want to take this moment to thank our panelists for making time to come and share with us their thoughts and insights. I really want to thank you on behalf of APC and ADB and DDP. I also want to thank the delegates also for making time to come and listen in and engage with us. Hopefully you found this conversation insightful. We're going to be sharing the recording, the link afterwards. You can share it with your colleagues and friends, and perhaps maybe also watch out to re-listen to it, so that when you listen to the conversations next week, you can be able to make the threads and see perhaps maybe new questions will be raised about where this BRICS conversation and its role in African development agenda would be after the summit next week. On those few words, I want to thank you again for making time. I want to wish you all a good afternoon, and we'll be sharing the link thereafter today with everyone who was on board. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.